Good morning, everybody. Welcome to class this morning. This is our next to last live stream, I believe. I think next week is our last live stream for the semester. We've almost made it to the end of the semester, which is really exciting. You know, back in January, February, when we were starting class, this time seemed like it was a long, long way away. And now here we are, here at the end of April. Just about 10 more days left in April, and then about 11 days in May, and the semester is over. So just a little bit about, how things are going to go for the remainder of the semester. We'll have a regular live stream next week. And then the week after that, I have some ideas for sort of a synchronous meeting that you could elect to be a part of if you would like. However, I'm not entirely sure how that's going to work quite yet. I will give you more information in a Blackboard announcement when we get to that point. Basically, what I would like is just, kind of a synchronous time to where we could get everybody together and maybe look at different things and talk about different things, or, do some kind of final exam review or what have you, as we approach the end of the semester. So also, as we approach the end of the semester, this is just a reminder that, hey, fall semester is coming up. So you probably want to go ahead and start looking at that. If you haven't registered for classes yet, you want to register as soon as possible. We want to make sure that we have the classes that you need. The longer that you wait to register for those classes, the higher possibility that that class is not going to be there. Now, you all know that our classes aren't filling up, but with the way things are these days, they are looking at enrollment earlier and earlier in terms of deciding which classes are going to run and which classes are going to be canceled. So you don't want to wait. You want to get the classes you need right off the bat. And for the majority of you, that's going to be Web 215. Also, you'd probably need Web 210, Web 140, and DBA 110 this fall. The first fall is a bit of a loaded semester in the programming and web development program. So this the second fall here that we have coming up. So if you want to know more about that, you want some more information about that, what you should be taking, anything of that nature, go ahead and contact, you can contact me if you'd like, and we can talk about what your schedule needs to look like for fall. So today we're talking about accessibility. And accessibility is incredibly important when it comes to creating websites. And we'll talk about why it's important in just a bit. But in this module, we're not really looking at any new code. Okay, that's one of the things that we want to kind of right up front examine here, that we're not really looking at any new code. The way that we can implement a lot of changes to make things accessible, well, that has to do with old code, things that we've learned throughout the semester. So as we kind of approach this, that's one of the interesting things to think about here, is that we're not really learning anything new. We're just learning how to take the things that we already know and implement them in a way that is accessible. And so you might have some questions right now as to what accessibility is, or what any of this means, or why we would want to do this. Right? And one of the big things here is that in terms of why accessibility, well, websites are made for people. Right? And when we get into Web 210 in the web design class this fall, one of the things that we'll talk about in relation to accessibility are edge cases. And we'll talk about how the fact that there are no such thing as edge cases. And so when we're making a website, what we're doing is we're making a website for people to use. And in turn of making a website for people to use, we want to make sure that everybody can use a website. One of the statistics that I always like to quote here is that there are roughly 2 billion people on Facebook. Right? 2 billion people on Facebook. So you might think, well, 1%. 1% sounds like a small number. But when you put that in perspective with, for example, the 2 billion people that are on Facebook, that's actually a very, very large number. Right? Because like 1% of 2 billion, well, that's going to be 2 million roughly, right? Or actually 20 million. Math is hard. Because we're going to take that, we're going to multiply it by 100, and we're going to get, 20 million. So 20 million people. 1%. And that's a lot of people. Right? So when we're thinking about things like, oh, well, there's not that many people that meet these qualifications, that have these issues, that need these things, well, our websites aren't just limited to the area around us. Like when we put a website on the internet, it is available for the entire world, and the entire world could use that website. So we want to make sure that these websites that we make for people are made for all people and not just some. Right? So when we're talking about accessibility in this sort of way, what we're talking about are people with disabilities. People who need to be able to access online information differently. And you'll hear me talk about things like screen readers and braille keyboards and various other things. And we call these things assistive technologies. And you might not realize it, but there are way more people that utilize assistive technology than you think. Right? I use assistive technology. Some of you watching this right now might use assistive technology, and you might think, well, no, I don't think I do, but you do, because, really, glasses are a form of assistive technology. So when we're talking about assistive technology, we're talking about breaking down barriers to access. Right? If I can't experience things in a quote-unquote regular way, maybe my eyes are a little blurry, they don't see as well, I don't have 20/20 vision. I need some kind of technology that can allow me to see better, i.e. my glasses. And so when we think about designing for accessibility or creating websites for accessibility, we can kind of think of it in terms of glasses and people who wear glasses. Right? When you think about it, like, as long as I wear my glasses, I can see things and I can interact with things in a quote-unquote regular way. But if I were to take my glasses off, well, there's a banner on the wall here in front of me about 5 feet away from me, and I have a little trouble reading it, even though the letters are pretty huge. So the way I interact with the world, the way I interact with things around me, it changes a great deal based on whether or not my assistive technology is allowed to work. So when we're thinking about coding websites for accessibility purposes, what we're thinking about is coding websites in such a way that allows the user's assistive technology to work for them instead of building new barriers in the way of the barriers that are broken down by this assistive technology. So there are many types of assistive technology that individuals can use online for websites. I have a simple list of them here. Things like screen readers or text readers. We actually have an example of this in Blackboard they have that little screen reader in there for you where you can press that little play button and it'll read the text for you. Screen magnification software. If you've been in seated classes here on campus, you might have seen some of the computer labs have a special station in them with a high contrast keyboard and a magnified monitor, and that's the purpose of that, is for people with low vision who have trouble seeing things that are on the screen unless they're blown up huge. Right, so you have that large print high contrast keyboard with a screen magnified screen there for you. Speech input software, things like Dragon Naturally Speaking. Tactile displays, so these are like braille printers, different elements that can actually display a tactile readout of what's on the screen, so that someone who's blind could use their hands in the same way they might read braille to figure out what's on a computer screen. And we also have alternative input devices, things like head pointers and motion and eye tracking devices and single switch entry devices, like if you've ever seen those accessible video game controllers that are out there. Right, like what they've done is they've diminished the need for having to have two hands to hit every button. You kind of take it and compress it to where everything can kind of be controlled in a different sort of manner. And so that's what we're kind of looking at there, because of limited or no motion that's available to somebody. So for a lot of these here, one thing that's interesting about these devices is that they're not just useful for people with disabilities who need help accessing things. A lot of them are useful for everyone. And, we kind of see that sort of thing a lot. When you think about the little screen reader that's built into Blackboard, like, that's not really for someone who's blind. Typically they have their own screen reading software that they're used to. That's more of a universal learning thing. That's something to help you kind of get through. Maybe you're a more auditory learner than a visual learner. And in that sort of way, you can just press play here. And you can do that. Right? Things like captions on videos. That's a big accessibility thing. Making sure your videos have closed captions. And so in making sure your videos have closed captions, that's going to help someone who is deaf or hard of hearing to be able to understand what's going on in the video. But it's also going to help people with regular hearing so that they can understand, maybe they're in a crowded, noisy environment. They can put on the captions to be able to better understand what's going on. Or maybe, it's an educational video and you just like to be able to read what's going on to kind of follow along with it. It's that sort of visual learner versus the auditory learner. All that sort of stuff. There's data that suggests that all those different learning styles aren't really what we once thought they were, but nonetheless, it still has some useful advantages and disadvantages for people. So when we think about these assistive technologies and we think about how we are coding websites, how we're coding our HTML specifically, or our CSS, what we want to think about in general is ensuring someone who has to use these assistive technologies to be able to interact online, ensuring that with the way that we've coded our websites, that they can. Because if we take certain steps toward inaccessibility, maybe we think it just looks nice, or maybe we got a little lazy in what we're doing, it's almost akin to like going up to somebody and taking your fingers and rubbing them all over their glasses. Right? With my glasses, I can see well, but when my glasses are all greasy and fingerprinty, well, that's just, that's blurred my vision again. And it's rendered my assistive technology useless. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that we are coding websites in such a way that these assistive technologies can work to their fullest potential, because what that's going to do is that's going to bridge the gap between an individual with disabilities and being able to access a website in a regular manner, being able to go on there and get the information that they need to get. And this becomes increasingly important, as you've all seen. This is an ever online world, right? Day after day after day after day, more things are just moving to the internet, especially after what we've experienced over the past, year and a half. Things are just moving to the internet. And so it's critical for us to understand how to make the internet a place for all people. Now, we're not just thrown out there into the wilderness without any kind of guidance. We have some standards that we can follow, and these are our WCAG standards. Our WCAG standards, WCAG. This stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. WCAG. Pronounce the acronym as WCAG. 2.0/2.1. 2.1 is relatively new. 2.0 is relatively old. 2.2 is currently in the process. So as we are learning these things, like these are ever evolving, ever changing, we're moving forward here. But WCAG or WCAG, they're the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and they were established by the World Wide Web Consortium. Now, that name should sound familiar to you. If it does, then you know a little bit of internet history. Right? The World Wide Web Consortium came out of a project at CERN in the late 80s, early 90s, where they developed what we now know really as the World Wide Web. The software that carried on to being able to deliver websites to us. So in terms of what we receive on websites, the World Wide Web Consortium is the standard bearer. And so we use their standards as a means to understand what is accessible and what is not. Now, originally, these WCAG 2.0 standards, they came in 2008, and they extended into version 2.1 in 2018, and you can probably understand why, right? I mean, think about what happened in the decade between 2008 and 2018. All kinds of stuff, right? Got a lot more Web 2.0 stuff, a lot more social media stuff. Extend that into Web 3.0, into Internet of Things, into all these other sorts of things that are now out there that need to have guidelines for them. And so with the ever-changing internet, with new things like mobile standards that we have to address. This stuff moves quickly, and that's why, they're already working on 2.2, which is going to be reviewed this year and I believe released next year. So the version of this class I teach next spring might be a little different here, based on whatever the new 2.2 standards are. Although they don't really take away standards, they only add standards, because they have this backward compatibility motto, right? Like, if something if something meets 2.1 standards, then it also meets 2.0 standards by extension. Now, there are 3 levels of accessibility in our WCAG standards: 2.0, 2.1, whichever, doesn't matter. There are 3 levels of accessibility, and these are A, 2A, and 3A. And these different standards are different levels of accessibility. And while we're talking about these different levels of accessibility, it is important to bring up that something could technically meet a standard and still not be accessible. Based on, what you like, if you add alt text, for example, that doesn't accurately describe the image. You've got alt text, but it's still not accessible. Now, of these levels of accessibility, A, 2A, and 3A, level A is the lowest level of accessibility, and it's really considered to be the bare minimum. Right? The bare minimum in terms of making a website quote-unquote accessible are the 1A standards. We also have 2A standards, which are the goal standards, really. When it comes to kind of our goals for our level of accessibility that we want to achieve, most people oftentimes will shoot for those 2A standards, with a smattering of the 3A standards thrown in. 3A standards, by and large, I consider to be nice to haves. It definitely does improve the level of accessibility on a website if you're achieving 3A standards. But there are some compromises to other things that you're making when you get into those 3A standards that could impact usability for other people. So, in general, I like to compromise at 2A so that we can have that going for us. Now, we're going to look at some of the standards. We're not going to look at all of the standards, but we are going to look at some of the standards. And for a full list of standards, we have the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, that's supposed to be WAI, not WIA, little typo there. WAI, Web Accessibility Initiative. All right, that's the second bullet there. World Wide Web Consortium's Web Accessibility Initiative, W3C, WAI. Website for the full list of standards. And we actually have that website pulled up here. So let me navigate through my sea of windows that I have open, so we can have a look at this website really quickly. And so this is our Web Content Accessibility Guidelines overview from the W3C. If you want to see the link, let me zoom into that here. That's w3.org/WAI/standards-guidelines/WCAG. You can pause the video there if you need to get that URL. I think I also have it in the Blackboard course. But this gives us a link to our complete standards. You can link to the WCAG 2.1 standard right here. And this gives you the complete standards. Now, I don't think this really lays out the standards in the best sort of way, because it takes our standards and it puts them in different categories. And when we'll talk about these categories in Web 2.10. What we call our POUR, POUR categories. And again, we'll talk about this in a little more depth in how these are kind of laid out in Web 2.10 when we're talking about user experience from the perspective of individuals with disabilities for accessibility standards. But essentially what we have here is our layout on the side. These are things that are perceivable. These are things that are operable. These are things that are understandable. And these are things that are robust. And so as we approach our standards, we're approaching them from these different points. Perceivable, things that we can see or interact with, experience, if you will. Operable, that has to do with interaction. So perceivable, things that we can kind of see or feel, or perception with our with our senses. Operable being things that we interact with. Understandable being whether or not we can understand, and then robust being the robustness of your accessibility. Now, when we look at what's perceivable, we see, all sorts of stuff here. We can click on our perceivable heading and we can see all of our levels, and they kind of take everything and mix it together, where you have 1A standards, 2A standards, and 3A standards under your perceivable heading. What I like to do, since we're just getting started learning about the standards, and we like to say, well, let's shoot for the 2A standards, is I like to kind of take everything and put it into standard, and that's what I have in our slideshow here. So for example, we have things like our level A standards, and these are some, not all, of our level A standards. And we can see that we have some here from each of our POUR, from our perceivable, our operable, our understandable, and our robust. That's what the 1, 2, 3, and 4 are. And so we have non-text content, non-text content, should be a colon there, provide text alternatives for non-text content. And so what this is if you have any images or anything like that, what you have to have in its place is some kind of contextual understanding of what's going on in that image. So if you have a picture, and that picture needs to convey some kind of message, then what you need to do is, somewhere around it, have a paragraph that explains it. And that's level A. That's the bare minimum. Adding captions for videos with audio. That's the bare minimum. Having info and relationships in a logical structure. That's the bare minimum. Having a meaningful sequence, presenting content in a meaningful order. That goes back to something that we were talking about all the way in Module 1 when we were talking about using our headers in order. Using H1, H2, H3, H4 in order that you need it. Right? Which is significant. That's for accessibility purposes, because one of the things that you don't realize is the way that people navigate through websites who are using assistive technology. When you look at something like a website in terms of how how someone with a regular sighted ability interacts with a website, something that you might do is you might just go through and scan the page and look for the header. Well, if you can't find the header, if you can't see the header, how can you find the header? So that's what we have here with this sort of, because we can use an assistive technology like a screen reader, and we can say, oh, give me all the H1s. And it'll bring up a list and read it out of all the H1 headings in the document. And so then, in essence, that turns into skimming, which is pretty good. Use of color, we don't use presentation that relies solely on color, and that is significant. Right? And that's something that we see a lot of the time. You might have seen something like that before where, in order to see the status on something, you can either see a green dot for good or a red dot for bad. What if you're colorblind? You have that durotropic color blindness. You can't tell, you can't really discern red and green. And so if you had that sort of color blindness, maybe you do as you're watching this video right now, you can't tell the difference between those two colors because that's a pure green and a pure red. So they both have the exact same value. There's no contrast between them at all. So when we say don't use presentation that relies solely on color, this is exactly what we're talking about. Now, this could be changed relatively simply. For example, what if instead of a green circle, we used a green check mark? And instead of a red circle, we used a red X. Now we have some visual identifiers that are going to help people out in addition to color. So anybody who were colorblind, who were to look at this situation, would see check mark X versus red and green. Every link's purpose is clear from its context. That's another one. Page titled, useful, helpful, and clear page titles. That's something that we've been talking about since the first module. You know, to be W3C compliant, we said that we need to have a title for all of our pages using those title tags. In our accessibility standards, we're saying, hey, yeah, we want to make sure they're there and they're clear, so someone who's going to the page for the first time knows what the page is about, knows what the page is, knows what it's about. Labels give instructions. So we're using those labels that we talked about in the form module, so that elements have a semantic purpose. And our goal is to build all elements for accessibility in name, role, and value. So as we're examining that, one of the things to consider there is that, what we want to do is we want to make sure that we are sort of building things with an accessibility first mindset. Going into building of a website to try to ensure that it is going to be accessible from the upkeep. And, a lot of times people will think, well, if I try to make something accessible, it's going to be ugly. But no, that's something we talk about more in, some of the next level classes, like what in the design class. Just because something's accessible doesn't mean that it has to be plain or ugly. You can, add a lot of styling and keep things within our standards. So in the interest of time today, because I do want to show you a bunch of other stuff, I'm going to skip some of the longer descriptions. If you'd like to read some of the longer descriptions, I'm going to encourage you to go to that WCAG website just so you can see how exactly these things lay out. And one of the interesting things that you can find is they'll tell you what you need to do to pass. For example, I'll do one really quickly, this non-text content. Users who can't see images, hear audio, or perceive video benefit from having text alternatives. Text alternatives must provide the same information as the non-text content. And this is where people get caught up a lot of times. So I think this is a good one to do when we talk about alt text. And we talked about alt text in relation to media when we were in our media module. We talked about alt text, right? And this is why we include alt text, is for accessibility purposes. So, again, right? Like, we're not learning any real new code. We're learning how we implement properly the code that we have. So where a lot of people kind of fall down is if we look at kind of a code pen here, and we can just kind of throw in a little placeholder image here. IMG src equals pixum.photos. We'll make a 300. There we go. Just a little placeholder image from Pixum. So when we look at an image like this, or when we're putting an image into our website, one of the places where people kind of fall down when they're writing alt text is they want to write alt a picture of whatever. right? And that's unnecessary and really inappropriate for what we're looking for accessibility purposes. For alt text, what we want is a description, and not just a description of the image, although that might be what it is for you. A description of the purpose. What sort of information would you like your sighted users to get out of this picture? So the fact that it is a picture is is immaterial, right? The screen reader will even tell the user picture. So this needs to be a description of purpose. And if it is just decorative, you can leave your alt tags there empty, just like that, and that will indicate to the screen reader that this is purely decorative, and it doesn't need to worry about it. Right? We want to convey that purpose. It's a big deal. So again, for the interest of time, let's just kind of skip through. Look at some of our other ones. Let's look at some 2A standards. And again, we can get really deep into all of these, and we can talk about them at length, but we're going to try to not go that long today. Let's see here. Where are my A standards? Contrast. This is a huge one. The contrast ratio. The contrast ratio between text and the background is at least 4.5 to 1. And so remember that when we're looking at level 2 standards, these are the standards that we want to hit. Those level 1 standards are bare minimum. So we're going to need to have those bare minimum level A standards met. But our goal here is our level 2A standards. And so what I want to do is I want to really show you what this means for contrast ratio. And so what you want to do is, there's a bunch of websites out there nowadays that will analyze the contrast. And I've got one of them here. The WebAIM contrast checker. If you want to go there yourself, you can Google WebAIM contrast checker. It'll take you right to it. Or you can go, here's the URL, webaim.org/resources/contrast checker. You can pause the video there if you want to write that down. And so here we see our foreground color and our background color, and we can enter different foreground colors and background colors to see what would work and what wouldn't work. And you might look at something like this and you might think, well, what I want to do is I want to put my favorite color on the website. My favorite color is this kind of light blue. Really love this light blue. Well, this shows us the accessibility of it. And we can really see it in terms of the lightness bar here. How close this lightness bar on the left is to how close the lightness bar on the right is showing us that ratio visually. And we can see the ratio printed out here. It's at 1.32 to 1. So they're very close to being similar. 1 to 1 would be the same value, essentially. And our goal is 4.5 to 1, bare minimum for standard 2A text. So if we start moving this lightness bar to the left, we can see things change and we can see things start to pass. Now we can see large text here, which is text that is 16 points and above. Right here it passes, but it still fails for standard size text, 14 point and below. So in order to have a color in that family, there we are. to get that gets close, we have to go to about right. That's not quite. It just jumps me right to 5, which is fine. So in order to have something that'll work, that's in that sort of color family, you got to go pretty far. And this is also going to change based on what your background color is. If you go to a darker background color, that's moving this lightness bar, and that's changing your contrast. And if we approach something that's with a similar lightness ratio, there we go. This is a 1-to-1 contrast ratio, which means that the value of the color on the left is the exact same as the value of the color on the right. And this is something that could trick us a lot of times, because if we go with like contrasting colors here and give them the same value ratio, I can only get pretty close here. Just because these bars are kind of finicky. You might think, well, I can read that. That's readable. But for someone with low vision or color blindness, that is the exact same color. They would see absolutely nothing there. Which is quite interesting. Right? So we want to make sure that we're using a contrast checker to check the differences between foreground colors and background colors. We want to be able to resize our text without loss of function. This is going to be more relevant for responsive websites. Like if you're building responsive websites from the beginning, that's going to easily meet this standard. With the way that we learn with our statically sized websites, that might cause a little problem here from time to time. That would require you to have a little bit more attention. But we want to make sure we do that. Images of text, just don't use images. Don't use images of text. If you have to use an image of text, then you shouldn't be doing that. I mean, one of the great things about being able to write our code is we can write whatever we want in our HTML markup, and we can make it look like whatever we want it to look like with our CSS. So there's no reason to ever use a picture of text. Headings and labels, making sure they're clear and consistent, and using consistent icons and buttons on every page, so that when you go from page to page, you don't have to learn a new standard. Everything's consistent, everything's clear, everything's understandable. And so what I'd like to do is I'd like to look at some 3A standards really quickly, and then have you look at our assignment. And so our 3A standards, I won't spend a whole lot of time on. Again, remember that with all of our standards, our level A standards, our level 2A standards, and our level 3A standards, there are more standards than what I'm showing you. I've just kind of cherry-picked a few of them out that are the most important for our purposes. And so 2.4.9, which is a 3A standard, this is one that I think should be necessary for every link that you put on a website, is link purpose with the link only. Every link's purpose is clear from its text. Think about that, right? Like, think about like you're a person who, is blind. You want to navigate a website, you want to find the links. You can pull up a list of links that are on the page with your screen reader. But every single one of those links in the text for every single one of those links is click here, click here, click here, click here, click here. Which one do you click? Which one has the information behind it that you need? You know that there's a link on the page that has the information that you want. and you know that you don't want to sit there and listen to the entire page, so you can get to that link that you need. So you pull up a list of links that you have available to you via your screen reader, but they all just say click here, click here, click here, click here. And that's meaningless. You want to make sure that what the link is clear by the link's text. Break up content with headings. You know, this is just like if you were writing a paper in English class, right? Like that sort of stuff. You got a ton of content, you break it up with headings. This makes it more skimmable. You know, you can go through it easier. If there are any strange words, explain any strange words. If there are any abbreviations, explain any abbreviations. You know, on top of all this, things like using our semantic tags instead of using our, you know, instead of using some non-semantic tags. Use things like article or section instead of div. Use strong instead of bold. Use mark. Use use those semantic tags instead of the bold tag or italic tag or, whatever else, right? That's something else that we talked about early on in the semester is how important semantics are. And then the semantics are important for this purpose. When we boil it down, right, we've discussed all these little things along the way as to why we do this, but we didn't really put it into context with for the reason, for what reason. And the reason is accessibility. The reason is so that people who are accessing our websites can access all of the websites, everything that we have for them. So what I want to do is I want to kind of flip over now to our lab for this module. In this module, you're given this fixing accessibility project. So I have this code pin here that I've already made for you, but it's got a lot of problems. And you can probably see some of the problems right off the bat. There's at least 10 things in here that you want to find and fix. Now, in order to do this, it gives you the instructions here, but I'm going to demonstrate it for you. It tells you to click the Edit on CodePen button, which is here. And that's going to take you to my version of it. So what you want to do is you want to click this fork button that's going to be down here at the bottom. And what that's going to do is that's going to make a copy of it and put it on your account so that you can make all your edits, make all your changes, save it, and submit the link. And so as we look around here, and we look around here in our code, we can see some issues. And I'll go ahead and mention some now, just to kind of give you a heads up. Like, should we be using a div tag here? I wonder. Should this be a div? Should this be an H2? Should that be a B? Should that be an I? Should this be an H2? What about these pictures here? What's wrong with them? And then we have some stuff that's not in our markup. Things like, I wonder if there's anything wrong with these colors. That might be something we would want to check. So you just kind of want to scrutinize this website, look at things that you think might be accessible or probably inaccessible, change the things and make them accessible. Save it, submit the link like you do with every other code pen. That's the task. So that's all that I have for you for today's live stream. I'll probably be putting out some other material in addition to this that will kind of help you understand things just a little bit better. But again, that's all that I have for you for today's stream. I'm going to hang out in the chat for just a minute to see if anybody who's here with me live has any questions. If you're watching this recorded and you have any questions, please let me know. But again, that's all that I have for you for today. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.